Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Evita O'Shell and joining me again is Tom Campbell. Tom, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Evita. It's my pleasure to be back again. This is always a lot of fun.
It sure is. And today we are going to be continuing with part 4 of practical applications to the MBT, or my big toe theory of everything, as per your work. And so for anybody who may have missed parts 1, 2, and 3, I definitely encourage our viewers to start there. In part 1, we discussed practical applications in terms of how your ideas and your research and the idea of a virtual reality and just in general consciousness studies, how it applies to practical everyday life in terms of money, work, or career choices. In part 2, we talked about our diets, our sleep, more encompassing the health and everyday practical applications of that. And in part 3, we talked about relationships and how we relate to one another, specifically in romantic relationships between the opposite sexes or even of the same sexes. And so today in part 4, we are going to be talking some more about relationships because they do make up such a big part of our life. Of course, we'll be talking about children, parenting, as well as even sexuality, our emotions, a little bit about death, our entertainment choices, and wrapping it all up with as much practical applications as we can leave the audience with. So again, for anyone who is unfamiliar with your work, I would definitely recommend starting to get to know your work a little bit, perhaps through some of the lectures, Tom, you have on your YouTube channel, or even with the first 3 parts. But again, Tom is a leading authority on consciousness studies, a lecturer and author of the trilogy My Big Toe, My Big Theory of Everything, and you can learn more about him and his work at my-big-toe.com. So Tom, as we get right back into things, we will be picking up where we left off with the idea of relationships. And there has been some fantastic feedback from the audience in trying to really make sense of what the information that you shared in our last part, what it means for them in their life. And of course, some people were very much in alignment and really felt what you were saying had a lot of value in their lives. Some people perhaps felt that it may not apply as much to their life for whatever reason. And so if we can start a little bit on this, because as you were sharing even last time a little bit, can we start to help people understand when you share, for example, some of this information, is it a one-size-fits-all prescription, or is there more to the information, more to the story, so to speak?
Oh, there's a lot more to the story. There's very little good advice that's a one-size-fits-all, because we're also very different, and particularly when you're dealing with gender differentiation. I kind of talked about the males at one end of the pole, females at the other end of the pole. And in general, that's not such a bad way of looking at the differences between male and female. But in the real world, of course, there are males who fit better under, the female end of the pole, and there are some women that fit better under the male end of the pole. And there's a lot of us that have pieces of our personalities under different poles. There are parts of us that kind of fit the descriptions under the male or under the female or feminine side of the pole, and that doesn't make us confused gender. It just makes us whole people.
Yes.
You see, it's not that we're confused and we really need to get all of our personality and wad it up on one side of this dividing line or the other. That's not the point. It's that whole people tend to have very complex personalities for 100 different reasons. And we need to realize that when I talk about, the men do this, the women do that, I'm talking about what I call, under the fat part of the curve. Well, what I'm talking about, the fat part of the curve, is you look at a probability curve. Mm-hmm. It starts out, I don't know if can you see my finger trace the line here. It kind of starts out low and then it goes up. That's the fat part of the curve, comes back down, and then it's low again. And out here on both ends is what's called the tails of the curve. Okay, and then the fat part of the curve is what's in the middle. Well, if that's number of people versus characteristic, the number of people up on the y-axis and characteristic going this way, then basically it says that most of the people are under the fat part of the curve. That's where most of the numbers are. So it's the large majority of people. But there's always people who are, 10 sigma. Now that's a math term, but, it's 10 standard deviations, or way out under those tails. And it's not that there's anything wrong with them. They're just not like everybody else. They're different. They're not a kind of a common member of the herd, if you will. They have attributes that are a little less common.
Right.
And, those people may be the mildly retarded or the super intelligent. They may be, the people who are 7.5 feet tall and the people that are only just barely 4 feet tall. These are people that fall out under the edges of the curve of where the average is, or what's normal. What's normal means what's average. We use this word normal as if that's what it's good to be, and not normal means there's something wrong with you. But that's very prejudiced. It's not like that. You see, normal just means average. So to be normal means that you're most like other people in this characteristic. Well, in the male and female, we're all over that curve as individuals. Most of us may be under the fat part of the curve of being male or female, but there may be parts of us that are out on the tails of that curve a little bit. And that's fine. Mathematical sense, that's not normal. But what I mean here is that's just not average. It's perfectly okay. And you should take the descriptions that I'm giving, or the advice that I'm giving, and realize how it works. What's the principle here that makes this work? And then apply it to yourself as an individual, because all individuals are different. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Look at the dynamic. What's going on? How is it working? We're trying to get rid of the need-based relationships and work ourselves into love-based relationships.
Right.
And we find it's very difficult if we just do that. So we say, okay, you and I, from now on, we're just going to treat each other, with love. Well, if we do it that way, it tends to fall right back into the, I'm doing this a little more than you are, or you're not doing it as much as I am, or, you're not as, this is just as you should be. We start judging each other on how the other one is doing, you see, because we're both trying to do the same thing. And we start judging the other based on what we think we're doing. And that gets us right back to an ego-based relationship. Even though we're saying that we're trying to, act with love, it just creates a situation that doesn't seem to work well. So that's why we start with, okay, men, you're in charge of this. You started off, and eventually, of course, it turns out that there's nobody in charge. Yeah. The men are just in charge to get it going, you see. Once it's done, then you have a man who's trying to make his woman happy always, and a woman who's trying to make her man happy always, and they're both in leadership roles, or they're both in following roles. It just is. It's not that the thing always should stay with the way it starts out. That's just how do you break the ice? How do you get this ball rolling? Well, you give the men and women different jobs so that we don't start judging each other on how, you're not doing as good as I'm doing. It just, it's a little psychology at work there, that it just tends to work better if when in the initiating role, the men take charge. And there are cultural reasons why, for most of the people who are under the fat part of the curve, this is like most of the people most of the time, those roles of the men as the initiator are reinforced by our culture. So you're not, it's not really something that, let's put it this way. It's something that's a little easier for people to do, because those roles are cultural roles. They're not necessarily fundamental roles. Right. There's something different altogether about fundamental male, fundamental female. But in our culture, we generally have to work with what we've got. And most of us, whether we admit it or not, our perspectives are driven to a very large extent by our culture. We accept those roles even if we don't like them, because our culture tells us that this is right, this is what we need to do, this is how we should be. So rather than try to struggle against those roles, we try to use those cultural beliefs, if you will, in order to help us get to the place that we want to go. And there are cultural beliefs that hurt us as well. And maybe we'll talk about that today. There's some basic cultural beliefs that tend to trap females in our society because we have a cultural beliefs tend to reflect the male point of view because it's a male dominant society.
Right.
In a female dominant society, it would be the other way, And I'm not talking about right or wrong. It's not a judgment here. I'm just saying that's the way it is. And if that's the way it is, then and you're part of the culture, then you are susceptible to some of the ways that the culture, hurts us, and some of the ways that the culture will boost us. And we need to use those dynamics to help ourselves kind of rise above the culture, if you want. Because then once you really get it at the idea that it's a love relationship, the culture pretty much becomes irrelevant. Yes. You're not stuck in any of those old ways of being that you feel like you have to be because that's what your culture tells you. You kind of become acultural at that point, and none of that cultural stuff then is important. You leave it all behind.
I think so much of that is also playing a role and playing out in more people today, because I see so many men and women balancing that feminine and masculine energy within themselves, and hence going into more, if I can say, sort of perhaps really high quality consciousness-based relationships, or more love enlightened relationships where there's a completely different understanding and alignment between them. Do you foresee that perhaps that is where we may be going when we are releasing these sort of cultural dogmas of the past to move into, again, more of that balanced feminine, masculine energies in both sexes?
Yes, absolutely. The point is that once you are a love-based being, then roles no longer have any meaning. You don't play a role. Right. You just are.
Yes.
You see, everything is just you expressing yourself at the being level. Once you get rid of that fear and ego, then the roles disappear. You don't play a role. You're an authentic, genuine human being, that's love-based, because you've gotten rid of the ego and the belief that tend to make you cling to these rules. The rules affect you. The rules are something that you need when you have fear, because the rules tend to order things. The fear is very disordering. So if you're a fearful person, and if you have ego, like most of us have, and if you're wound up with beliefs, like most of us are, then the rules tend to give us structure so that we can kind of muddle our way through. So we find the rules to be important at that point. Well, you outgrow those rules. You outgrow that culture. You outgrow roles. You outgrow trying to be some way that because you think that's the way you should be. You just are you. And because you're love-based, it works perfectly. And it's very, it matches up perfectly with a person of the opposite sex just being themselves. The two are very complementary, you see. So it all just works good. It's not a matter of who's in charge and who's not. There is no in charge and not once you get past, those roles. But we have to start from where we are. Yeah. You can't start in some place that sounds good, but that's not where you live. You need to start in your own backyard, which is ego-based, fear-based beliefs, cultural rules. So that's the place where we have to start, and then we have to kind of work our way out of that trap and basically become free just to be.
Yes, very, very much so.
So yes, that's where we're going.
So with respect to then a lot of people who are still heavily identified with their, sex or gender, that, oh yes, I'm a female and I'm a woman, or I'm a male, I'm a man. From your experience of visiting other realities or non-physical realities, is there even any hint of any kind of gender, or are we just beings?
Well, it depends on the kind of reality that you're in. If you're in a tightly constrained reality that is sort of like our physical reality, in a virtual reality driven by a very precise and tight rule set like ours in this physical reality, then mostly there are male, female distinctions, there's gender, and there's roles, just like it is here. It tends to be that way. Why? Because the people in these virtual realities also have fear and beliefs and ego and expectations. They're doing the same thing we're doing. They're in a different virtual reality than ours, but they're trying to grow up. And when you have people who are struggling to grow up, and you have, kind of a physical virtual reality, then you're going to have this kind of struggling. You're going to have people trying to play roles, people trying to assert themselves over others for, because of these roles. It's more politics and power. It's kind of power politics of the games that we play, whether it's at home, who's in charge, who gets to tell who to do what, who has to obey, who doesn't. It's all of this sort of thing. And as long as there's lots of fear and belief in the world, then there's lots of that. Now you go to the places that are more, say, dreamlike, more out of body like, where you don't have tight rule sets, where basically it's just individuals interacting, messages being sent between entities of consciousness. Now the gender is not such a big deal. People still have ego, but the gender just doesn't play as much because it's not quite as interactive. You see, you don't have beings, they interact intellectually. They're interacting with data, and we would call that intellectually, but they're not really interacting so much as we do here. And as that interaction fades, it's like interacting in a chat room, right? It's all cerebral when you're in that chat room. So when you're in that chat room, you still may be playing male and female roles in the chat room, but it's not really authentic. It's game playing. It's not so real. So you don't really have a lot of real gender identification going on in these looser reality frames. Although within those reality frames, there are, societies, there are groups, there are clans, there are families, and there are male and female. But it's not as important.
Right.
There's not that much role playing.
A strong identification to it, right?
Yeah, there's not a real strong identification to gender in those realities. That's more of a physical type reality.
Now, when we speak about, of course, relationships and gender specifically, another question that comes up on a practical level is, what is the role of sexuality according or in the frame or light of virtual reality? Because as we know in our physical reality here in the mainstream kind of view, we do have, and for centuries had, a lot of people who have chosen this spiritual, very strong, strict, perhaps like a monk lifestyle, who have said, the way to sort of free yourself and liberate yourself, enlighten yourself, is to sort of deny all the pleasures of the body, release that, and, sexuality basically plays no role in that. And then on the other side, of course, when we look at our Western culture today, we are seeing, pretty much the opposite, right? Very, very promiscuous sort of relations between males, females, males, etc. How again, where does the role of sexuality fit into the idea of a virtual reality?
Well, there's a couple of things that we need to say about that. One is that sexuality is a result of our rule set. Okay, we evolved to be what we are. This universe, us in this universe, cells and then beings on this planet all evolved, and the process of that evolution, procreation in the higher life forms turned out to be sexual procreation. That worked well. Why did it work well? Because it was efficient, it was survivable, right? And it was it kind of is the way it is because that was the survivable best way. That was the lowest entropy approach to survive and to procreate in this rule set, in this simulation. So sex is a part of our being. It's the way we are. It's not an evil part that is stuck in here to challenge us. It's just a part of us. Being human is to be sexual. And humans in particular are very sexual beings. We are probably more sexual beings than the other animals on this planet. We don't have Eurestus that comes, every 6 months or so, that we mate, by the clock or by the calendar, we mate all the time.
Right.
So we as humans are very sexual beings. And to deny that or to make that wrong or bad or distracting is not good. That's trying to take something that you are and deny it, and that always just causes neurosis. It just causes people to have problems.
Right.
So you have to start with the idea that that's our heritage, that's our biology, that's our rule set, that's the nature of our virtual reality, that we are very sexual beings. Now, one may also, you have the others who would say, yes, but the sexual thing is so distracting. If you're on a spiritual path, you can get very distracted by it. Well, what is kind of right and wrong, what is good and not good, is not judged by action. It's not what you do or don't do. It's the reason for doing it or not doing it. You see, it's the intent behind it. So if your intent is love, then whatever it is you do based on that intent, that loving intent, is good. And that will contain sexual, conduct. Sexuality is part of that love. Now, if what you're doing is fear-based, egoic-based, belief-based, and you have sexual content that's basically driven by fear and ego and those kinds of things, then it turns out to be very distracting. It turns out to be a problem. It turns out, you have all this, heartache stuff going on where people need things and they're not getting what they need, so they do this, and, that affects other people different ways, and you have this big soap opera struggle going on. Well, that's not because sex is a problem. That's because ego and fear and beliefs and expectations are a problem. You see, so that's the thing. It's not that that you should become a monk and not have sex. You are just denying a part of your humanity. But if you are full of ego and fear and belief, then your sexuality, your sexual things that you do are going to reflect that fear and ego and expectations and belief, and it isn't going to be as good as you'd like it to be.
Right.
It's going to be problematical. It's going to cause problems. You're going to hurt others. It isn't going to work. You're going to be unsatisfied. All this misery and problems that we have around sexuality, I love her, but she doesn't love me. I want this, but she won't give me what I need. And I need this. He needs that. And we go on and on. Again, the soap opera, right?
Yes.
The soap opera of he, she.
Yeah.
All of that has nothing to do with sex causing problems. All that has to do with ego and fear causing problems, and belief and expectation causing problems. So, again, it's not what you do that's a problem. I can't think of any particular behavior that I would say, if this behavior takes place, it's always wrong. It's why.
Yeah.
It's the intent. And I can often say, with this intent, that's always wrong. If you have this intent, and this intent is, let's say, to get what you want and use people to make that, happen, it's always wrong, no matter what you do. Even if you're sweet-talking those people, so that you can get them to do what you do, it's still wrong.
Yeah.
You see, and it doesn't work out in the long run. You end up shooting yourself in the foot if you approach things that way. It's self-destructive as well as destructive of other people. So that's kind of the view there. Sex is just sex. It's just part of us being human. We make it something that's distracting and something that gets in the way and something that causes trouble because we're not grown up. We're not really grown up enough to express our sexuality with wisdom.
Right.
We express it as children. It's like what if the 4 and 5 and 6 year olds were all very sexual? What would you expect? You'd expect mayhem, wouldn't you? You'd expect a lot of gimme and grabbing and kind of things. Well, in the world of consciousness, we're children, and what we get is kind of daycare sex, if you like. It's all about us. Give me that toy. That's mine. And that's the way we interact with each other. But that's the same with relationships. They tend to be need-based, you see. they're need-based, and part of that need is a sexual need. Okay, but two people with sexual needs that are mutually satisfying, well, that's okay, but it's just needs being satisfied. It doesn't really go anywhere. And if you take those two people and just watch them eventually, as a few years go by, it's not mutually satisfying anymore. You see, it disintegrates. That's not a basis to form a relationship, because that's still need-based. The only basis to form a lasting relationship is love.
Right.
So we tend to approach sexuality kind of for all the wrong reasons and with all the wrong attitudes. And that's why sexuality gets a bad rap as being kind of a bad thing, that it causes a lot of trouble, and you need to just leave that alone or you're going to get in trouble.
Right.
You'll be miserable. It's not the sexuality that's the problem at all. It's how we approach it and the needs that we come at with. So it's the intent that's wrong, not the acts.
Well, and that ties in so perfectly into the idea really of having children, because of course one of the biggest needs in our culture, or most cultures on our earth still, is the idea that two people get together really out of a need to create children. And for a lot of people, there is still that strong belief that a life without having children somehow has no meaning or purpose. What can you share about this? Because of course, on the other hand, again, as we are evolving and maturing, we do have a lot of people, especially a lot of young people in their 20s, 30s, who are choosing not to have children in this particular lifetime. How does all this sort of fit in with us growing up and our virtual reality?
Well, it fits the exact same concept that we just mentioned. It's not what you do or don't do. It's not really whether you have children or don't have children. It's why you have children or don't have children. If the reason you don't have children is because they're a lot of trouble and they cost a lot of money, and I'd rather play and go out and stay out late at night, so who needs any kids hanging around? You see, then that's not a good. You're not having children, but for a poor reason. It's an ego-driven reason.
Fear.
If you're not having,
Exactly.
if you're not having children because that's just where you don't feel your path going that way. It's not what seems next in your evolvement and where you're going. Well, then fine, do that. So it's not a matter of whether what you do, whether you have the children or don't have the children, but if your intent is good. If your intent is love-based, if your intent is not need and fear-based, it's not that you're afraid of having children. If you're afraid of having children, that's why you don't have them, because you're afraid you might not be able to raise them right, or you're afraid it would be a lot of work, or you're just afraid it's more responsibility than you can stand, then that's the wrong reason. You see? So it's have children or not have children isn't good or bad on its own. It's only good or bad based on your intent to come to that decision.
Right.
Now, we do have a certain urging proclivity, biology that drives us to have children. It's not so much that people get together because they want to have children as they get together because we have a drive to pair up, to get together. Males seek females. Females seek, men, and we pair up. That's the nature of our species, that we just do that. So there is that drive. And there is a drive more in the female than the male to have babies, because the female has the babies. You hear about her clock's going off, well, she's 30 years old and hasn't had children yet, or 35 and hadn't had children. She's really looking for a situation where she can have some children. Well, there is these innate pressures to have a relationship, and as you, but it's the way you approach those pressures with what intent that makes the difference. So just because you have a biological pressure doesn't mean you have to give into it, or that it's the only thing you have to do, or that it's the only right thing to do. Yes, there is a biological pressure there, but you're in charge.
Exactly.
You see, you get to make decisions. And if your decisions are love-based, they're good decisions, whatever it is you decide. So that's kind of the thing. Also, we as a species, and other animals will do this as well, we tend to have more children when times are good, when there's plenty to eat, jobs are plentiful, times aren't so hard, and we tend to have fewer children when times are hard.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just us doing that on an intellectual level. That's also programmed in our survival, in our genetic code. Pigs will do the same thing. If you treat the sows badly and you take their piglets away too soon and so on, to where the sow is depressed and unhappy, the sow will stop having pigs. Or instead of having 5 or 6 or 7, might get 1, or 2. They basically shut down their reproductive, system, because times aren't good for it. Survivability is now a lower probability, and then you don't reproduce as much or as often. So that happens as well. So there's lots of things that kind of affect that and affect our urges, and everybody needs to do what they feel is right for them.
Yes.
And if they do that based on love, it will turn out to be right for them and everybody else. If they do that based on fear or belief, then it probably will turn out to be a struggle.
Yeah. And that's what I see myself, and of course so many others around us can see also in their lives playing out, that still so many people are having children, unfortunately, out of ego and out of fear. Who's going to take care of me when I'm old, or will I fit in with my friends, or whatever the case may be, or again that my life won't have purpose and meaning unless I do. And it's that aspect that again, if we can help people sort of rise above and connect with their intent to be more love-based rather than need-fear-based, right?
Yes, exactly. And there are wonderful advantages in growing up that children bring to you, but you can find also advantages in other things as well. It's not like having children is the only route that that you could or should take. For instance, when two young people and in their 20s, let's say, typically start having children, they soon find out that this idea that the world centers around them and that they're the center of their own universe starts to crumble, because the children start demanding them to be more responsible, to be more about other than them, and suddenly they have to give things up and do things differently because they have these children. And that's very good for them, because parents give up a lot of ego in the process of having children, because the children demand that the parents send their attention to them rather than to themselves. And there is a natural nudging and urges there too, that you take care of your children, you protect your children, you want your children to grow up. So it is there are some good things about that. There are also people that have the opposite experience. They have trouble with their children. There's difficulties raising it. It creates ego and fear. So you can have the downside of that. Again, it's not the having children or not having children. It's what you make of it. There are, it's a personal choice, and there are good things and bad things that could happen either way.
Yes.
But all the bad things that happen either way are because of your fear and your ego, and all the good things that happen the other way are because of your love. You see, so it's most of these things where we say, well, should we do this or should we do that? It's not the doing that's important. It's why do you want to do this and that? What's your intent there? Are you running from something, or are you moving towards something that's better? It's those kinds of things.
Beautiful. Yeah, very, very, very good advice. And of course, another aspect that comes under this umbrella is that a lot of people today, of course, are considering what about our population on planet Earth, because we do hear lots of reports how we are in an perhaps overpopulation crisis, and perhaps the Earth won't have enough resources. And I think you did mention once before that it's really not about the resources, it's how we use them, again, right? That there could be more than enough to go around. But are there any other points that you'd like to add in terms of how the amount of people or humans or beings on this earth ties into a virtual reality?
Well, the number of people that are in this virtual reality equals the number of independent, individuated units of consciousness that can play in this game. So the game is only as big as the number of people here, at least for humans. Now, there's dogs and cats and horses and bumblebees and other things that also have consciousness playing here. But as far as the humans go, there's only, each human is an avatar, say, for a consciousness that is at the core of that character. So as the numbers of people get bigger, then, the number of players get bigger in the game. And there's always a point where more players doesn't really help the gameplay process anymore.
Right.
So when you get to that point, then what happens is that the number of players either stays the same or starts to go down. It's just a natural thing, and those processes happen with other animals. You have too many deer, so the deer eat all the food. Now the deer are starving. And now the predators on the deer, they start waxing. There's a whole lot more mountain lions and a whole lot more, whatever it is that eats deer, because for them, food's plentiful. So, more of them grow, and as they grow, that pulls the deer population down. And as the deer population goes down, now there's too many cats. There's too many mountain lions because there's not so many deer for them to eat. But then their population goes down. Those things tend to take care of themselves, and they're not really terrible things. I mean, we think about it from our little picture view, and we say, oh, that's horrible. There's too many deer. Some of them will starve to death. It's just the way it is. It's the way the natural system works. That's the way the ecology balances itself.
Right.
Things come and go. And you just have to say, well, that's the way it is. And if we get too many people to the point that it is crowdiness and survival gets difficult, you'll find that the population growth will slow down and we won't quite have so many people. So I'm not, I don't really see that as a really big issue, in that in the short term, in the local goal where those people are too crowded, there may be some unpleasantness. But in the big picture, that'll take care of itself.
Yeah, right.
So we have to not have the little picture view. In the little picture, oh, how horrible. Too many people, not enough food.
Right.
That won't be good, but that won't last for a long time. It's
Regulating.
It's self-righting. It's self-regulating. And for us to say, well, this is us, okay, deer can't regulate themselves, but we can. That is very problematical, because do we have the wisdom? Do we have the understanding, you see, to do that? Whereas the larger ecosystem does have the wisdom and understanding. It all works out. There's 1,000 different variables that all balance themselves independently when you let it happen naturally.
Yes.
When you go in and say, oh, okay, we'll take care of that. We'll take all the people who have dark hair and brown eyes and we'll get rid of them, because we got too many people. Well, that's not a good idea. You see, that's an unnatural pruning of the human race. It's not good. And every time we try to make up rules like that, it's an unnatural pruning, and it generally isn't going to be good. I would say just, not worry too much about that overpopulation. It will take care of itself. We are also just another animal in the ecosystem. We have to not think of ourselves as being superior to all.
Yes.
Yes, we can modify things, and we have brains, and we can use them, but we have to use them wisely. And there's really not that much wisdom loose in the land to trust that if we start making rules about how to regulate who can have children and who can't because we have a population problem, I see more room for mischief than I do for, good and wise solutions to a problem.
Yeah.
So until we become a whole lot more love-based, which isn't anytime soon, then I would tend to let Mother Nature solve those problems as they do. And yes, there'll be some horrible times now and again, but that's small picture, small term. In the big picture of things, it's okay.
Right.
All come back into balance again.
And that's what I always find is the perfection and intelligence of nature, is that it always finds a way to balance itself and work things out. So good words of wisdom there as well. And I know we've touched upon just going back to the idea of parenting, once of course people do decide to have kids, in the series of videos that we've done about a year ago now. So again, people can look those up, and you've shared some fantastic information there as well. Is there any other new information in light of the virtual reality and your work that you wish to share with people? Because how we grow up is so dependent on how, of course, we are raised, especially those first 7 years, which now science is telling us that is so critical with how that brain is just sort of, conditioned so easily, openly, and is like a sponge. What do you share in terms of, to parents who are, again, thinking, okay, how can I approach parenting in a more enlightened way?
Much of the same in that, we have to be careful that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot with our own cleverness. For instance, we talk about those first 7 years. Mm-hmm. Many people would think that they are doing their children a great favor if they can teach them, get them, so by the time they're 2 or 3 years old, they know their alphabet and they know their numbers. And by the time they're 4, they're reading. And by the time they're 5, they're reading 6th and 7th grade material and so on. We can do that. But in the little picture, that seems like, okay, we're going to advantage our children. We're going to put them ahead because they're going to know more stuff. Mm-hmm. But what are you doing to their minds? What are you doing to their characters, to their worldviews, and so on when you do that? See, there's a price to pay on the other side. So it's just like we're smart. We can solve our population problem. All we have to do is do these things to reduce population. With the way people are now, we said that's probably not a good idea. Well, it's the same thing as parents. You can do things that seem like they're obviously good and they're going to advantage your child, where because of your ignorance, you don't realize you're going to disadvantage your child in other ways. There's a price to pay for that. There's a time when the children live kind of as much in the larger reality, in the non-physical, as they do in the physical. Mm-hmm. They're very much at home in both worlds. The world is a magical, mystical place. And, most 5-year-olds are mystics. Automobiles are magic. All kinds of things are magic. And they see more holistically. They're more right-brained at that point. Where we teach them to be left-brained is when we begin to teach them to read. That's logical process. Here's a sequence of letters, and they have sounds, and you put them together, and these are the words. Memorize these words, and da-da-da-da. That's all left-brain process, you see. So if we start that process too early, what we're doing is taking a time where they need to integrate holistically, right and left, and kind of gain some sense of big picture thinking and being, and we force them to linear process. We don't care about that right brain. That right brain will make you a space cadet. That's not good. We don't need that. What we need is develop your left brain, because that's what pays and that's what sells in our cultures, left brain skill. So let's get that left brain skill, but what are you doing to them as whole people, you see? Are you making them unbalanced left brain, people who can, think on a problem, but can't actually come to any solutions because they're not really whole people. Yeah. You see what I mean? So it's that same sort of thing. So what do you do as parents? Don't believe that you are so smart that you can use your intellect to find all the answers. Kind of let the intellect go. Number 1, get your own head on straight. Get rid of your fear. Get rid of your expectations. Get rid of your beliefs. 2, as it comes to making decisions for and about your children, do what comes natural, just the way you feel it. Don't drive it with your intellect. If what you feel is, this child is just a natural doing this, I'm gonna help them go as far as they want to go in their reading or whatever, at whatever age, because let them lead. Don't you use your intellect to say, oh, they'll be better if they can read by the time they're 5. You see, that's your intellect trying to create a result. Yeah. And instead of creating a result, you're better to support the flow, support the child in the child's interests and the child what they want to do, and what the child's comfortable with. Where do they want to go? And if you can support that and give them all the encouragement or whatever to be whatever they want to be in the way that is good for them, and you do that from your own intuition, then you'll do fine. Then your child will grow up as advantaged as your child can be. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're preparing your child for a 6-digit income. If you want a 6-digit income, if that's important to you, that your child be materially successful, then probably forcing them to read at 5, might be a good idea, because, again, left brain process is what pays in our culture. That's where the salary is, that's what's in demand. That's where we place the value. But then we as a people are very unbalanced. That's part of why we have, all the problems we have. We're very unbalanced. We try to solve everything with our intellect. And our intuition, what's that? Can't depend on that. You see, that our intuition is almost, science would tell you it doesn't exist. And, others say you can't trust it. Well, that's because you haven't really worked with it. You haven't lived in it. You haven't grown up using that intuition and developing it and getting it to work for you. So we become unbalanced when we use our intellects to try to kind of force our view of what we want to happen in the world.
Right.
See, those are the wrong things. All that is ego-driven.
That's right.
Ego-driven is, I want my child to make a 7-digit figure or a 6-digit figure. See, that's your ego. And if you start driving parental decisions with your ego, you're just going to cause problems. So first of all, don't believe that you're so clever that you can make all these manipulative choices that will then work out to your child's advantage. If you're doing it through your ego and manipulating, then it'll probably work out to the child's disadvantage in the long term, not their advantage, or at least it will be neutral. Just be in love with your child and give them everything that they need, but not more than they need and not more than they want. And don't push them. Let them tell you what they're ready for, and then support them. And they may never make a 6 or 7-digit figure, but that's irrelevant. Who cares? They'll be happy. They'll be more balanced.
Yes.
They'll have good relationships. You see, that's more important. So that's what I would say about, for parents and how they deal with children. Stop intellectually trying to beat the system. Mm-hmm. That's ego.
Now, what do you think about the other end of the spectrum? Because again, as with all things, we have a lot of parents today who, I'll just use the term loosely, are more new age thinking, where they will do everything you just said, even to the other end of the spectrum, where they want to cultivate intuition in their children and belief in magic and fairies very actively and openly. Of course, other mainstream parents would say, oh, what are you doing, right, to your child? But do you think that's perhaps, again, given the right intent of love, a healthier approach that we can balance things out?
If that comes from the intent of love and caring, then I think that's a good thing. As is teaching a child to read or play the piano. If it comes from the intent and caring, of caring and love, that's a good thing. But if that comes from the intellect again, it took me, 30 years to struggle to where I got to the point that, I saw bigger, reality than just stuff. And I'm going to train my kids. Now it's the intellect again.
Yes.
Now it's trying to manipulate a result. You're saying, here's the way I want my child to be, and here's what I'm going to do to, kind of make him be that way.
Right.
Well, you shouldn't be trying to make him be anyway. You should be letting him develop himself and be who and how he is. It's not your job as a parent to make your child be some way. Mm-hmm. It's your job as a parent to love that child and give him every opportunity to become himself to the greatest extent to which he can do that. You see? So on either end, it's not good if it's an intellectual pursuit. If you're doing it because you think it's a good thing to do, as opposed you're doing it because it seems natural to you and because your intuition says it's good and you think it fits perfectly with your child and the way your child works. Some children are more, some children are going to grow up into right brain adults. Some have more intuition, more interest in art and beauty and big ideas, and some don't. Some children want to take things apart and put them back together again. They'd like to build things. They like logical process. I was like that. When I was a kid, somebody would have looked at me when I was 5. They said, "Oh, there's an engineer," because I'd take things apart, put them back together again. I like that sort of thing. I was the one that very quickly learned how to put the square block through the square hole.
Yes.
Because that's logical process. Whereas to more right brain kids, they may be 6 months behind putting the square block through the the square hole, because that just doesn't matter that much to them.
Right.
It's not that important. Making that differentiation. So it's not, again, don't use your intellect to try to make children be how they will come in with some proclivities to be ways. You just need to be a good facilitator, if you will. You have to protect them and facilitate their growth. You don't want to manipulate them. And I want them to be more like this. They should be more right brain. I think they should be more left brain. Both are wrong if it's coming from your intellect.
Right.
Because generally, the intellect you see is mostly fear and ego driven.
Yes.
It's coming from the ego. I want them to be things that I wasn't, dissatisfied with yourself, fear that they're going to be dissatisfied with themselves, or fear that they will miss certain points that it took you a long time to find. They may or may not find those points. It's up to them, you see.
Yeah, because truly each one of us has such a unique journey of our own growing up that it's never as clear-cut as a lot of people sort of might think. And so, Tom, before we leave the topic of relationships and children and parenting and families, one other question that actually comes up a lot in discussions, especially when we touch upon New Age discussions and spirituality and enlightenment, quantum physics and things like that, is people wonder, is there a coincidence in terms of who we get paired up as our spouse, as our child, etc.? And some people refer to this as your soul family. In the view, again, of virtual reality, is there a certain set or rule set, I should say, I guess, to how we get paired up in any particular lifetime?
Well, there can be, but a lot of times there is not. There doesn't have to be. There's not just one way that this pairing happens. Quite a lot of it is random. And some of it is, you wouldn't say random, but constrained. In other words, let's say you grow up in a small town, and in a small town of 500 people, there are exactly 20 people in that town that are your age, plus or minus 3 or 4 years, and you're going to basically live in that town, and so are they. Well, you're going to end up paired with one of those 20, right? Because those are your choices. So it's not like, that's not exactly random in the big picture. It's very constrained, but it's sort of random within that little picture. So part of who you pair up with has to do with who's available in your vicinity, who you meet. Now, sometimes that can be nudged. In my own case, I was told that I was going to meet, the woman of my dreams. The person that I was going to live my life with was a 2-year-old when I was 14. And I was told that, and sure enough, that's the way it worked out. So we were in different states. We weren't even in the same part of the world, but I got nudged to there and she got nudged to here, and we ended up meeting, and see, it worked. So that was something that obviously was a setup from before.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be that way. And if you are at the beginning stages of your evolution in consciousness, you tend not to plan. You jump in and jump out. You come right back in, and whatever happens, happens, because really what you need is experience. You don't need any really specific kinds of experience yet. You just need experience. Eventually, you find out that your development isn't the same in all areas. And you say, well, here's an area where I'm strong, and here's an area where I'm weak. And now you start looking for more specific situations where you can better gain in that weak area instead of just pushing on the strong area. You don't want to get too far out of balance with yourself. So you say, well, now I'd like to work on this. And that may mean that there's certain individuals that, would help you work that together, certain environments or certain relationships. And then those might be nudged to put you into a space where you have optimum probability of learning those lessons that you most need to know. So then the more evolved you are, the more likely your incarnations are to be scripted to some extent, where you have people to meet, places to go, things to do that are kind of on your agenda because you've come here for specific purposes. So it sort of depends. For most people, it's probably more random than it is planned. And because it's planned doesn't mean it always works out. Sometimes people use their intellect instead of their intuition, make a right turn when they should have made a left, and it doesn't happen. You see, that happens. That happens as well. A plan is just it's a probability thing. It raises the probability that you'll get what you want and need as far as learning goes. You'll get a lesson kind of your choice, but lessons are always good. Whatever wherever you are, again, with the children, whether you have children or don't have children, you can learn responsibility and to give up ego.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't have to have children to learn that. Children are one way to learn some of that, but children are also a way to grow a lot of ego. People get very proud of their children and, you know, what they want their children to do and what they're doing and how their children are better than the other children. And, you know,
Yes,
you can grow
yes.
your ego as well. So, you know, there are things to learn in every, no matter what you do, you know, no matter what your work is, no matter what your environment is, no matter how poor or how wealthy, whatever, there are ways there for you to learn in your environment. Lots of ways that you can learn. It's not like, well, you know, I'm not learning much now, but if I had a better environment, you know, if I wasn't always worried about money or if I wasn't always this, I could do a lot better. That is false. You will do as well as you can do in any situation.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you learn different things in different ways at different times. So if you happen to be a poor, starving, you know, child in, you know, what it was, you know, Biafra about 20 years ago, you know, when I was younger, they had a lot of starvation in that country. Well, if that happened to be where you were, then what you learned is community and caring and family, because that was all very strong in those communities. Yes, they were starving, but they weren't trying to, you know, rip each other's food off. They shared what they had. So there was a lot of things to learn there. You know, it's that kind of thing. You know, no matter what your situation, you say, oh, those poor people, isn't that so tragic? But those poor people had things to learn.
Yes.
And it was an environment in which learning those things was very, you know, was optimal for them to learn those things at those times. So almost any situation, even the dire ones, even the terrible ones, you know, someone has a child again, and the child is severely deformed some way. Well, there's a lot of learning there for the child and for the parents. So it's sad in a way, but in another way, you have to realize that no matter what the situation is, opportunity for growth is still there. Mm-hmm. You can't blame your situation for not providing you, you know, opportunity. That's ego, you know, and fear and belief. You know, people always believe the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, you know, but generally it's not. It just looks that way because you need an excuse for why you're not doing so well, so you blame it on your grass isn't as green as somebody else's grass. Mostly, there's plenty of opportunity, everyone, in any situation, anywhere, under any condition. So that's why it's like, well, I would be more spiritual, but gee, I have a job and a family and a mortgage. You know, I can't go to India and, you know, become a monk and do all that kind of stuff. So what's the point, you know? That's not it. You don't have to do any of those things. Your environment, you know, with your job and your mortgage and your family is very amenable to you becoming a spiritual being. That's not a problem. And there are many monks who spend a lifetime in monkhood and never get off of square one. You see, that's not necessarily a sure bet either.
Yes, yes.
You know, they have also ego, belief, you know, expectation, issues they're dealing with. They're just dealing with it in another environment.
Exactly.
So, you know, we don't need to go do something different. We need to go be something different. And the two of those are just very different things.
Very, very powerful. And also, when you're talking about this, I love the idea, to reiterate again, is that really it's to keep expanding our views, our consciousness, because it's that bigger picture. When we see the little picture, things seem so always trivial and perhaps hard, etc. But it's that bigger picture perspective that helps us see the perfection in every situation and the opportunity there as well. So that's really, really wonderful that you shared that as well, Tom. And as we shift gears a little bit away from children and families and relationships, at the core, what they all have in common, of course, is our emotions. Our emotions, of course, play a big role in how we relate to ourselves, to others, to our environment in general. And you do have actually a lot of material out already in terms of when you talk about emotions and how they are good for feedback in this reality, etc. How else can they help guide us when we start to tune in and take our emotions seriously rather than think, oh, they're just out of control, I'm an emotional person, or whatever it may be, to use them to our advantage again from a love-based perspective to guide us in this reality?
Well, the neat thing about emotions and what makes them so valuable is that they come directly from the being level. Our emotions are not intellectually generated. They just happen. We just feel a certain way. So we often have this idea that we are perhaps more evolved than we really are. Our intellect, our ego tells us we're doing pretty good. We know a whole lot, and we kind of can pat ourselves on the back and feel good about ourselves. But that's from the intellect, and that may be true. We may be doing good, but listen and look at your emotions, whatever your emotions happen to be, and don't just cherry pick those emotions where you're feeling, very positive about things. Just look at all of your emotions in any given day or any given week. That's who you are at the being level. If your emotions are petty, she has more than I do, or she does this, or look, she's wearing the same dress I have on. And, if you have these kinds of feelings and it makes you feel bad and they're petty, then that's because at the being level, you're petty, you see? And then you have to realize that, that's me at the being level. And people don't. They'll have these emotions and then they'll think, gee, that wasn't good. That was awful petty of me. But then rather than say, well, that's how I am at the being level, they say, oh, that wasn't really me. You see? I'm not like that. That really wasn't me. I just had that feeling, that came out of my subconscious someplace, and that's not how I am. They define who they are at the intellect. At the intellect where they can convince themselves of how clever and good and true and nice they are. And that's who they really are, is their intellect. And that emotional stuff, that's really somebody else. That's the evil twin. That's not really them. They're not like that. Well, that's not true. It's just the opposite. That intellect is what you're pretending to be. It's what you are trying to be. It's your judgment of yourself, and it's very biased. That emotion is you. Just unadulterated you at the being level. So if your emotions, when things happen, when somebody is rude to you, what's your emotion? Okay, well, that's you. That's an honest reaction of you at the being level. So that's the good thing about emotions. They come straight from the source, unadulterated, and they are what they are. Own them. That's the way you are at the core, not some evil twin that's making you, act that way out of some subconscious, fear or something. That's just the way you are. In fact, talking about the subconscious, if you get rid of your fear and you get rid of your beliefs, okay, so then there's no ego and there's no expectations, you don't have a subconscious. Subconscious is only a model of, should we say, people with problems. It's a model of dysfunctional human beings. When Freud made his model that had a subconscious as part of it, it's because he was looking at a whole lot of dysfunctional people. And when I say that, I mean normal people, average people, people on the fat part of the curve. We're mostly dysfunctional because we have so much fear and belief. So if you have people with a lot of fear and belief, you'll see they have a lot of trash they swept under the rug down in their subconscious mind. Well, just the fear and the belief. You get rid of that fear and the belief and you are whole. You understand all of you. There's no part of you that's hidden away, you see. So there really is no such thing as a subconscious mind. That's just something that shows up, in a dysfunctional individual. So thinking that that's some evil part out of your subconscious that you can't control, well, that's not really the way it is. That the fact that you even have parts of you that push you around that you don't really relate to, that's because your fear has relegated them to not being seen. That's what your subconscious is. It's stuff you swept under the rug because you don't want to deal with it because it isn't pretty.
That's really, really good that you share that, because of course right now there is a lot of talk, especially as more people get interested in the deeper psychology of themselves, and we hear a lot of different teachers and experts talk about the subconscious mind and the conscious mind, and how really we go through 95% of our thoughts, our days, really just in our subconscious or unconscious mind, and very little is conscious. It's nice to hear you say this, because I believe it's going to be radically new for people to hear that, oh, wait a minute, I could, melt these all as one, and rather than this compartmentalized self where I feel I'm, I have these hidden things, like you said, that a lot of us feel like we have to heal and, this and that.
Yeah, well, we tend to, in our left brain dominant world, we tend to slice and dice and put things in various compartments. So Freud had, the ego was like the self, the intellectual self. And then sometimes that self could be selfless, and that was the superego that allowed him to have a kind of a spiritual quality occasionally. And then there was the id, which was driven, by biology and subconscious. And then you have this subconsciousness, which is that part of you that generally does for most people, runs most of their life. Most of their life, they are pushed and shoved and prodded by their ego, by their fear. And they do the things they do because of their fear and their ego and their beliefs. So that's true. They do live out of that world most of the time. But when you outgrow that, then it's just one whole you. You are that superego, that love, that caring. Not just that's a part of you that you can sometimes access. That's you, you see. And that intellect doesn't control everything. It kind of accepts and interacts with what happens. It's not the controller and the things that orders the world the way you want it. It's the part that kind of gives direction, makes interpretation, but basically deals with things as they are. And there is no id and whatever. You're aware that you're sexual. You're aware of all those drives and how they affect you and whatever. It's not that here you are, this nice person, and then what is it, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? Yeah. And then a Mr. Hyde jumps out of your id, and wants to grab that woman, and do something with her, and well, that's not me. That's my id, it's doing that. All that is just an excuse, that allows you to get out of taking responsibility for who you are.
Yeah.
So it's a fragmented model that basically takes us apart and makes us into a collection of various kind of semi-independent things. And that's not it at all. We're a whole thing.
Yeah.
We just are. And we don't have secret parts. The only time we have secret parts is if we deny parts of us, to ourselves. We hide parts. We sweep parts under the rug because we don't want to deal with them. We don't want to be responsible for them. We fear them. Those are all reasons for putting them out of sight. Now suddenly we've got ids and subconscious drives and all the rest of this stuff. And that's a very good model of a dysfunctional human being, but it's not really a model of a human being. And many human beings find themselves having to fit themselves into that model, and it doesn't seem to be a very comfortable fit.